and welcome to TyskySour. We are coming to the end of the second week of the general election campaign, a remarkable general election campaign for many reasons, which we'll talk about this evening. And I am joined by Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media.
What's up, Michael? How you doing?
I'm doing very well. I've been off my feet today, a bit tired. I think we should give credit where it's due today to Fox, who I've given a lot of links, a lot of tweets, a lot of videos to.
Fox, the producer.
Fox is the producer. I think they know that now. That
they're
Gary,
not as in Fox News, right? Okay.
Oh yeah, not Fox News. James Fox, who is our producer this evening. I gave him a lot of links very close to the beginning of the show, which was very unprofessional of me, but it means you're going to get some great clips as we go on. We are going to talk about, it's a recurring theme in this general election, fake news from the Tory party, a press release that is based on complete fabrications and nonsense numbers, potentially because they want to have a row about the nonsense numbers, but we'll talk about that. We're going to go on to discuss the NHS. The Tories had a bit of a hiccup in their general election campaign today when it was revealed that waiting times were longer than ever this month, so they just had those statistics revealed. And we're going to talk about a flame war that took place today between Farage and the Conservative Party, where some quite serious accusations were made.
Criminal allegations, Michael.
It's not cash for honours, is it? It's standing down, honours for standing
it's
down.
It's technically bribery. And it does fall under the 1983 Representation of the People Act.
We're going to start with Tory fake news. So this morning, Britain's newspapers were filled with another round of fake news from the Tory Research Department. This time, they're claiming that under Labour, immigration will rise to 800,000 a year. We might have a Sun article we can show you. I'll quote the first paragraph of it. Net migration would skyrocket to 3 times the current level under Labour's open borders policy, according to alarming Tory figures. This is a very Sun way of reporting this because you've got, they've covered their backs by saying Tory figures, but then they've added alarming to the beginning of it to say that the paper clearly endorses the sums that they have come up with. Priti Patel has warned voters that immigration would surge under Labour because Jeremy Corbyn has no credible plan. And I like this quote from Priti Patel just because of its, I suppose, ridiculousness. The biggest risk to our NHS is Corbyn's plan for uncontrolled and unlimited immigration forever.
Forever. It's like that Orwell quote about fascism and a boot stamping on your face. Forever.
Obviously, the figures are nonsense. They're based on the assumption that Labour agrees to complete open borders to anyone in the world. So this 840,000 figure is on the idea that we just end borders in this country and anyone who wants to come can come. I mean, some of our viewers will be pro that position. There's some good arguments.
It's not going to be the policy of the Labour Party.
Some good arguments for it, but it's not going to be the policy of the Labour Party. They're also designed as a dead cat. So the Conservatives knew there would be embarrassing statistics released later in that day. That's not conspiracy. It's just, the NHS statistics are released on the same day every month, and the government obviously get advance warning as to what is going to be in them. But this managed to become the story of at least this morning. I think by now, actually, the NHS story, all credit to the BBC, was leading their 6 o'clock news. So they hadn't completely gone with this fake claim as they did with the £1.2 trillion, which was the last figure made up by the Conservative Party.
Well, that was different because it was the Sundays, wasn't it? And the thing is, Sunday is quite unique in that, even though circulation of Sunday papers is really in freefall, actually the biggest selling newspaper right now in Britain at the weekend is on a Saturday. It's the Mail. The Sunday papers very much still lead the whole sort of media narrative. So whatever the Sunday papers print, that's what the news is for the day, even if it's nonsense like it was with the 1.2 trillion story. I mean, that's what we'll see time after time. And so bit harder to do that with the daily papers.
So, what you get is you get the Sunday papers. So with that £1.2 trillion, it was the front of the Mail on Sunday, the Telegraph and the Sunday Times. And then what happens is the BBC reports the row. So the BBC doesn't report that Labour manifesto will cost us 1.4, or Labour's plans will cost the country 1.2 trillion pounds, because obviously, it's not true. So they report about the row.
Yeah.
And that's
the
precisely
framing.
how
Labour deny that they'll spend.
Yeah, Labour deny they'll spend 1.2 trillion pounds in their first term, which I suppose brings me to the next question. So as we know, those headlines often are Labour deny. Should Labour deny that they will allow 840,000 people into the country every year? Should they deny it, or does that feed the story?
Am I going to ruin this by talking about a Corbyn video we're going to show shortly?
No.
We're not going to show that video? Okay, great.
No. I mean, we're going to show it quite shortly, so if you give away parts of it.
Well, I just thought that the response the optimal response was in that video where he says, when politicians talk about immigration, it means they've run out of excuses. It's a very good line, and it's also very true. The Tories can't talk about, underspending with the NHS because of cuts. They can't talk about a failure with the economy, with productivity, GDP per capita, wages, etc., because that would be undermining the economic orthodoxy which they've championed since the late 1970s. So you just talk about immigration. And so that's I think that's a great way of pivoting. You go, look, and we've talked about this pivot so many times, and Bernie Sanders is kind of the specialist at it. When politicians run out of excuses, they talk about immigration. And the big things people need to talk about in this election, falling wages, home ownership, and an NHS in crisis. And people go, yeah. So is that necessarily answering the question? No, and you don't have to, because like you say, it's a bullshit number they've generated from nowhere. You don't need to dignify it with a response.
Yeah. Well, I think what you can do is you can dismiss it. So you dismiss then pivot. So you say this is fake news made up by the Tory research department. Now let's pivot to what matters. Because if they say, are you going to do this? And you're sort of like, oh, maybe no. You have to dismiss it first to get permission to pivot, but then you pivot. And today they did pivot well. So we might be ready to show the latest video, which was shared from Jeremy Corbyn's Twitter account and his Facebook page. It's brilliant. We'll talk about it after it shows.
Please, one at a time.
My daughter's school is falling apart and there's just not enough teachers to cope.
My mother needs surgery and she's been waiting 6 months.
I got made redundant and can't pay my rent, but there are no council houses.
Look, I know you're all angry, but there is one simple explanation. It's all his fault.
Huh? What's Ali got to do with my mother?
Well, he's an immigrant. If we get rid of Ali, then medical waiting times will be shorter because we'll have more doctors.
Actually, I am a doctor.
But what about the services you've cut? Our schools?
His fault.
Housing?
His fault.
Hospitals?
Look, whatever the problem is, it's because we don't have enough money. And we don't have enough money because we have to spend it all on Ali.
What about the money you've just given to that guy?
He's just the CEO of a major tech company that needed a tax break. Don't worry about him.
But if you need money, couldn't you just stop giving it to him? He clearly doesn't need it. You start giving it to schools and hospitals instead.
Sorry. He's a job creator.
He hasn't created any jobs round here. He isn't part of our community. Why would he care about us? I trust Sally more than him.
Look, let me level with you. I would love to put more money into housing and healthcare and education, but my hands are tied. I have to give wealthy corporations massive tax cuts because of Ali.
Really?
Is the kind of video where you really see the value of having Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. So people, I remember, it was kind of a centrist talking point actually, where they said that people always complained about Ed Miliband's controls on migration, but then Jeremy Corbyn is the leader and obviously the Labour Party is still going to have controls on migration. And in one sense, the Labour Party did go into the 2017 general election with a policy that was tougher on immigration than Ed Miliband's because they were saying freedom of movement would end after Brexit. But the difference between those two politicians is the way they run a campaign. And so whilst Ed Miliband decided that, immigration is an issue, so we've got to put it front and centre in our campaign, it was one of their top 7 promises, which we saw on the Ed Stone, the tombstone-like giant stone, which he thought was a good idea to put his 7 key pledges. So they made controls on immigration one of their 7 key pledges. And that's the opposite of a pivot. That's inviting people to talk about migration. So, I mean, I'm in favour of having at least some controls on migration. I don't think it'd be a good idea to have open borders at this point in time. But you don't put that on a tombstone because the whole point is someone might say, what is your immigration policy? Are you going to let in millions of people? Are you going to have open borders? And you say, well, obviously we're not going to have complete open borders. But I want to talk about the NHS. I want to talk about XYZ. You don't engrave it. And that video is precisely what any progressive should do, which is if you are going to take the migration question head on, you don't take it head on by saying how tough you're going to be. You take it head on by saying the reason we're having this conversation is because there are vested interests at play who want you to be talking about, in that video, Ali, want you to be talking about your immigrant neighbours, or I suppose in these situations it tends to be an anonymous migrant because people tend to like their immigrant neighbours. They just don't like the anonymous spectre of the migrant they don't personally know. And that's something that I can't think of. I mean, I'd be interested to see, tweet us if you've seen any other leader of a mainstream social democratic party take on the immigration debate in such a, I mean, simple but head-on and I think quite brave way.
Certainly not in Europe. Certainly not in Europe. I don't know, maybe in Canada or in the US in the last 20 years there's been somebody, obviously not including Bernie Sanders. I'm trying to even think in democratic primaries in the last 20 years. I can't think of anybody.
The American thing to do is to say we're a rainbow nation, we're a country of immigrants. But I don't know how much they say the reason. Well, obviously, no one in the Democratic primaries other than Bernie Sanders would say the specific reason they are trying to bring up migration as a talking point during this election is because they want to protect their rich friends. There aren't many people in Democratic primaries who are able to say that.
Sanders?
Other than Sanders, I was saying before.
Yeah,
Sanders.
no, I'm saying maybe
Obviously,
even Sanders is not even that explicit. I mean, that was really explicit, right? Or has he been that explicit in the past?
I imagine he has. Again, I haven't seen a specific clip.
It's well, definitely in the Anglophone world, I think it's unrivaled, right? You know, it's definitely it's never happened in this country. Completely unapologetic anti-racism. And there was a really good tweet actually yesterday, which really made me think. It was tweeted by somebody I don't follow, and I thought, oh, that's great. Sometimes you think there's so many smart people out there. And they said, people say Corbynism's been ineffective. Well, Keir Starmer was on a picket line with McStrike, and he's loved by FBPE Liberal Twitter. Now, 5 years ago, people that were sort of self-identified, sort of radical centrists, were not standing a politician who was going on picket lines with ununionised, precarious workers in the service sector. That wasn't happening. And I think this is another signifier of something quite significant is going on. The country's been polarising around values for a long time, for more than 10 years, but actually the left hasn't been making its own argument at that level. You've obviously had grassroots activism.
The left have apologised for their values.
That's right.
Sorry, we're so moral, which means sorry we're so righteous and moral that we won't give you the things that you want, which was kind of the Ed Miliband line.
Yeah.
Like, sorry if we're too nice for you.
And the media loved that.
We will try and be a bit meaner to satisfy
The media loved that. The media love these kind of like very moralising left-wingers. They're not left-wingers because they universally go on to Sky or BBC and they attack Jeremy Corbyn. I'm a lefty, but... And they love those people because they've got no concrete offer. They're not willing to actually take on the establishment around these really key issues. And like you said, it's just kind of mealy mouth. And you know what? 10 times out of 10, you're going to lose. There are two strategies available to the left right now. One is the one that's being pursued by the Danish Social Democrats, which is economically redistributive, but also quite racist. Sure, that can work. Unapologetically socialist, but also they're taking, jewelry from refugees. Or the argument that's being made by Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, sort of left-wing populist going on a class cleavage rather than, a xenophobic one. Those are the two options available to you. And sort of what Ed Miliband did was kind of like
somewhere
neither.
in between, yeah. And I suppose when you say they're successful in the sense that they can be electorally successful.
You can win an election. Like the Danish Social Democrats right now are probably the only sort of... They're the only Social Democratic Party which has actually won an election impressively and against the odds in the last couple of years in Europe. Maybe the exception of the PSOE.
So on what should be the messaging strategy when it comes to migration and immigration, I think is basically general agreement on the left. I don't think you'll even see many people on the Labour right who quote tweet Jeremy Corbyn's video there and say, oh, this is nonsense, this is the kind of thing that's going to lose us an election. Because when it comes to messaging, it's quite, even though you have to be quite brave to do it, it's quite obviously the correct thing to do in electoral terms. When it comes to actual policy, so what should be Labour Party migration policy in their manifesto, you are going to see much more disagreement and potentially a bit of a row. This was, in the news, but also it's been being debated on left Twitter and within the party over the last few days, because the Clause 5 meeting is going to be coming up on Saturday. And what that means is you have people from the trade unions, people from the shadow cabinet, various members of the stakeholders that make up the Labour Party, and they decide what's going to go in the manifesto. We won't find out about it straight away unless you have a leaker, as you did in 2017, so it'll be released at some point in the following week. But at the moment, there is a debate as to whether the motions which were passed at conference in September are going to find their way, copied and pasted directly into that manifesto, or whether they're going to be watered down and shifted somewhat. And the particular conference motion that's relevant to this discussion was the one to defend and extend freedom of movement. The row this week partly started because of an intervention by Len McCluskey in an interview with The Guardian. He said, and I quote, "We will have to see what's in the manifesto, but I don't think what conference voted for is a sensible approach, and I will be expressing that view. It's wrong in my view to have any greater freedom of movement, any greater free movement of labour unless you get stricter labour market regulations." There was also a report in the Financial Times yesterday or the day before. I'll quote from that with a sort of insight about what they think is going on in the party. So I quote again, "Mr. Corbyn's team is looking for ways to respect the spirit of the conference vote on immigration, including extending full voting rights to all foreign nationals living in the UK and closing all immigration detention centres, but is looking to pare back on free movement." Emily Thornberry, Shadow Foreign Secretary, appeared to rule out free movement becoming party policy when she told BBC Radio 5 Live on Monday that the party wanted managed migration when the UK left the EU. She said that was consistent with Labour's Brexit policy of remaining in the customs union, but not the single market. There was a contrasting intervention from Diane Abbott today when she tweeted a link to Labour list with the text of the motion that passed at conference, and Diane Abbott says, "This is the actual resolution passed overwhelmingly at Labour Party conference. I fully support the policy to maintain and extend free movement rights." Aaron, you've got sort of a free... I suppose there's two positions here, really. Well, three positions. So one is, should Labour commit to having freedom of movement even in their Brexit deal? Two, should they extend freedom of movement? You've got so two different issues with, that make three different positions, I suppose. So where do you stand on this? What do you think's going on here?
I think The Guardian wrote a misleading headline and actually misframed what McCluskey said. And what lots of people do is they read the headline and then they go, "I saw people sharing it, bastard." Now, I don't agree. I probably don't agree with Len McCluskey on immigration, but these are the words he said. "We will have to see what's in the manifesto, but I don't think what conference voted for is a sensible approach." So I would disagree with that bit. However, I agree with what he goes on to say. "It is wrong in my view to have any greater free movement of labour unless you get stricter labour market regulation." Diane Abbott wouldn't disagree with that. You know, nobody is proposing, because we would have a Labour government, that you would have freedom of movement without an increase in labour market regulations. That would mean trade union laws being changed, changing legislation around some of the stuff that's been the major criticisms of the European Union with regards to labour regulations. The ones relating to like the ferry in Norway or whatever it was, not Norway, Sweden. You know the one I'm talking about?
I don't know the one you're talking about at all.
Basically, membership of the European Union can undermine certain labour standards in very marginal niche ways. And some claims are, well,
there's a posted workers directive, which is the main one, right, where you can employ people
Laval
you can
Viking.
employ people from a different country and pay them according to the standards in that country.
And there's also the Laval Viking thing, which is people can go check that out. But basically, you could stay in the EU and still have higher levels of labour regulation with regards to that. Anyway, Labour is quite clear it wants to up the labour standards in this country. That's what it would like to do in a number of ways, through on the statute books, through policy, through creating a Minister for Labour with Laura Pidcock. So nobody's proposing within Labour what Len McCluskey is saying. But I would agree with him. You wouldn't want greater freedom of labour without some attendant reforms to labour laws.
But there is a disagreement.
Nobody's proposing that, though.
I don't think you can propose a disagreement because
there is a disagreement, but it's not as intense as I think it might appear from that Guardian headline.
Well, what you could say is, given the fact that no one in the Labour Party is proposing we don't raise labour standards, there's quite a simple solution, which is Diane Abbott gets what she wants, which is free movement, and Len McCluskey gets what he wants, which is free movement, only if we increase labour standards. And you say, well, fine, that's going to make a great manifesto then.
Yeah.
The FT article, though, suggested that the Labour Party didn't want to have freedom of movement as part of their Brexit deal. Obviously, many people would be backing Remain anyway, which requires that Britain maintains freedom of movement. But what do you think about this idea that in the Brexit plan or the Brexit deal that Labour proposes, should freedom of movement be in that?
I just think we should have the status quo. I just think it's an easy thing to understand.
The status quo being what? Norway plus?
Yeah. I mean, even Iceland's in EFTA, right? Iceland's not as close as Norway is even, and they have freedom of movement with the European Union. They have visa-free travel, basically. I mean, what do you want to call that? I don't know. But basically, Icelanders can come here and they can access benefits, etc., the exact same way as a European national can. I don't know how that works. Is that with all EFTA members, the Faroe Islands? I think it probably is. So, I mean, you could just argue for the status quo. I mean, I don't see it's not that complicated. And I think the argument actually at conference around the freedom of movement, that motion, I always understood it as, okay, well, whatever Labour's policy on Brexit is, it has to mean at least the status quo.
At least the status quo on freedom of movement, because
Yeah.
it has to mean not the status quo on something, right? I mean, and
No,
I
freedom
suppose
of movement.
that's the issue, right?
Yeah,
Which
freedom
is
of
that
movement, I entirely, that's what I mean.
if Labour are proposing they put a manifesto, or if Labour are proposing in their manifesto they put forward a referendum with Remain versus a Leave option, they do need a credible answer as to how the Leave option is different to some degree, right? Or do you think that actually Jeremy Corbyn should just say the people voted Leave, we would give them, we would let them leave from the political union of the European Union, and then when in the debate, which will be next Tuesday, and we'll have a live TyskySour as soon as that debate finishes, when Boris Johnson's saying you're going to give them Remain versus Remain, what's Jeremy Corbyn's answer if he's said that in the Leave deal there is going to be freedom of movement?
We're still, even with Boris's, even with the no deal Brexit nonsense, there's still going to be something quite close to freedom of movement with Europe, but with the European 27, with the EU 27. There just will be. They won't say it now. It might take 2 years, might take 3 years, might take 4 years, but you'd see it. There just would be.
What about extending freedom of movement? So that's the other debate.
Yeah, that's a separate thing, right?
What do you think about it? Do you think there
because
should be extending freedom of movement in the manifesto?
I mean, I'm sort of ambivalent. I want us to take far more refugees. It's not a zero sum, by the way, but I would rather us be more committed to taking far more refugees. Personally, I'm perfectly happy with freedom of movement in the EU because that's the status quo. Perfectly happy with that. I would far rather us be having an argument about, look, we should be taking 4 times more refugees than we presently are. I think it's around 35,000 asylum applications a year. We could easily take 4 times that. I mean, I'd prefer to talk about that. I'm not against the freedom of movement thing. I just think that those, we could be helping 100,000 people a year that we're presently not. That would be my sort of counter argument. But I'm not opposed to freedom of movement. It doesn't push down wages if you have the requisite sort of high labour standards, etc., etc. That wouldn't be my preference, and that wouldn't be what I want to talk about when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the safest bet here is to stay with the status quo, right? But I think almost the policy is somewhat secondary to the strategy, because obviously the debate around migration has to be shifted in Britain, and that's more an issue of political argument as opposed to what is your precise policy. We have to have a policy which respects human rights, but the real break, I think, between Corbyn's Labour and, say, Ed Miliband's Labour, there will be very significant, materially important policies such as shutting detention centres, sort of abolishing or reforming the most grotesque elements of our border regime.
Yeah.
But Jeremy Corbyn's not going to get rid of borders, so there are still going to be, and so long as you have borders, there are still going to be, human rights tragedies, because there are going to be people who are trying to get here who aren't allowed to come here. So Jeremy Corbyn's Labour is not going to solve that sort of essential tension between the fact that if you have any kind of border, you are going to have some kind of border control. But what he can resolve...
Why is it a tension?
Well, it's a tension because...
you want borders for some things. Like, for instance, we don't want animals with rabies. I mean, even under sort of socialist, internationalist, quote-unquote, borderless world, you're still going to have... you're going to have to, right?
Well, I'm not in favour of open borders, but what I'm saying is, if you're
somebody bringing some sort of meat from bloody Ghana that's got, or Italy with the,
but we're not. But the reason there's a tension is because we're not talking about meat; we're talking about people, right? So the reason.
No, we are talking. I know, but it's a health and safety issue. So that is talking about people. We're not talking about. I'm talking about meat because that can, for instance, the free a borderless world where you can import some.
But I'm talking about people.
Bring in
so there's no inherent
swine flu.
There's no inherent tension by having borders when it comes to goods because you don't have to respect the human right. You don't have to respect the rights of goods.
We don't even have open borders for goods either. Like I say, like if you want to bring in some like meat from like certain
I'm not
parts of
saying
the world,
we do. I'm just saying that if any left-wing government, Corbyn's included, is going to have to deal with a system whereby there are going to be borders in Britain, and when you have borders, you're going to have border controls, and border controls tend to be fairly unpleasant. So there's going to be an inherent tension between having border control, having borders, and having border controls.
Depends who you are. Border controls for a British national going most places perfectly pleasant.
Yeah, it depends who you.
That's what I'm saying. Depends who you are, right? I mean,
it depends. But it depends who you are, because the reason people are quite pleasant when Britons want to come in is maybe because of structural racism,
or colonialism, yeah.
But it's also because they're less likely to stay, right? Well, I mean, the issue with migration tends to be well, the political issue in terms of why border controls are used is to stop lots and lots of poor people moving to richer countries. So that's why, the same tension doesn't exist when British people go on holiday.
No, I came back from Sweden. I went through Gatwick, 2 minutes, right?
Yeah, but you're talking about holidays.
Hold on. I went through Gatwick in No, let me finish, Michael.
Okay.
I went through Gatwick in 2 minutes. It was entirely automated. It was, and there'd be an argument there. Well, look, that level of automation, the sort of oversight, it meant that you could avert somebody blowing up a plane. There's an argument there because it's happened, right? In terms of the security checks and so on. Now, somebody else is going to have a completely different experience because they're going to be racialized in a certain way. They might be presumed to be a terrorist. On a different day, maybe I could have been. So, that's an argument against the racialization of people. Now, on the left, there's a debate about the relationship between borders per se, in and of themselves, and a racialized other, right? So, obviously, you need to have that debate, but I just don't think we're obviously not going to get. We've always had some form of, even people go, oh, well, we only had passports until the early 1900s. Well, there have been delineations between societies, whether it was linguistic, whether it was religious,
I think we agree here.
We do agree, Michael. We're very much at odds with the ultra-left on this.
Well, yeah.
Maybe you sound a bit more ultra-left than I am.
Well, no, the basis of the disagreement here is I'm saying there's always going to be a tension because if you have borders, which I think we're going to have, you're going to have border controls, and border controls are always going to be unpleasant if the purpose of those border controls is to stop people living here who want to live here. Your experience of borders there...
There'll be a measure of structural violence for sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
We
That's
agree.
what I'm talking about.
We agree.
And what I'm saying is that Jeremy Corbyn is not going to be able to resolve that tension.
No.
But what he can do is, one, sort of get rid of or reform the most grotesque elements of violent border regimes and shift the debate in terms of how the public think and talk about migration.
And also,
and he's doing the second one already.
Britain is it's a big country. It's the 5th biggest economy in the world, 65 million people. Us taking the lead on taking in refugees, lots of refugees, would be a big, big thing. And I'd love us to do that. When I was in Sweden, they said, oh, we've had this debate about, refugees, and the far right are doing really well on it, making loads of political capital out of it. And I'm like, yeah, but look, you took 90,000 people in 2015, 90,000. That same year, we took 35,000. Sweden has a population of 10 million. So basically, they took in 18 times more people than we did on a per head basis. And even if everybody in Swedish society says we want to have completely open borders, not everybody in the whole world can move to Sweden, right? So what that means is we have to have global coordination across all the sort of affluent countries to have progressive refugee policies. Okay, what can you do to catalyse that? Well, the major nations could start to have socialist heads of state, socialist governments leading the way, right? So that would be a big thing for me on Labour and immigration. I'm not really thinking about expanding freedom of movement beyond the EU 27. I'd far rather emphasise fulfilling, human rights commitments on refugee policy and having far higher levels of successful asylum applications.
Let's talk about the NHS in a moment, but first of all, you are watching TyskySour. We are Novara Media, and we rely on your kind support. So if you are already a supporter of Novara Media, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and give the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can make these shows more regular, put out more short, shareable videos, increase our article output, which has been brilliant at the moment. Definitely go to our website and check out what is being put out by Novara Media. As always, we like it when you like this YouTube show because it means that it appears in more people's feeds. We like it when you share it on Twitter. We like it when you share it on Facebook, and keep your comments going because we'll go to your questions at the end.
There was some of the comments even there about, is Aaron joining the BNP? No, I honestly think on the left, this stuff about open borders is a cover for actually not having a serious conversation about we destroyed the global south for 250 years. How can we have a fair planet where everybody can access the means of subsistence in a way that they can have a meaningful life? Right, that does not mean allowing hundreds, which is ultimately what the rational end of the argument is. Hundreds of millions of people have to go to the global north. How about we redistribute wealth so countries in the global south can be nice as well? But it's rather than make that argument, you sort of call everybody who says, we can't do that, even if we wanted to, because of climate change. A world of 6 degrees warming, most of the planet's either desert or under fucking water. You want to get 10 billion people. Like the southern hemisphere, in a world of 6 degrees warming, is Tasmania, Western Antarctica, and Patagonia. Like we need to not. This is just dumb. We need to have a global Green New Deal now, rapidly decarbonise, have a far more egalitarian economy globally. You know, that's what we should be doing. Sorry, I make no apologies for it. That's not fascist.
I don't know if they were talking about the open borders point or the thing where you're talking about meat when we're talking about migration.
That's true. I mean, that's true, man. It's like, look, my favourite meat in Italy is you can't get it in this country.
Let's talk about the NHS.
For that reason.
Let's talk about the NHS. So the reason that the Tories put out their ridiculous migration statistics today and they obviously had migration on their grid was because they have known in advance for a while that today was going to be the day that the NHS released their statistics as to waiting times and how or whether or not performance targets had been met. They knew this in advance, so that they were, obviously it was not Linton Crosby anymore. It's one of his protégés who is heading up the campaign at Conservative HQ. We were like, oh, what could we talk about that day, given that there's going to be some helpful statistics released about the NHS? It wouldn't be, tax policy, because then that links quite nicely to the idea that we should tax the rich more to fund the NHS. It didn't want to be healthcare, because then whatever announcement they make would be ruined by these awful statistics. So they made it, as Corbyn's video quite rightly showed, the one distraction that the ruling class always rely on, which is migration. But anyway, now we've talked about that, we can go to these actual statistics. Let's get up this tweet from Lewis Goodall, just because he summarised the statistics very nicely. New A&E figures have just been published. Bad news for government and patients. A&E targets performance the worst ever. The target is 95% of patients to be seen within 4 hours, but in October 2019, only 83.6% of people were seen within 4 hours when they arrived at A&E. That compares to 85% the month before and 89% last year. The 95% gold standard, so the target that 95% of patients will be seen within 4 years, was last met in July 2015. An even better example or a way or graphic in this case, which it is, presenting Tory failure, is potentially we can get up this tweet, which was handily, someone replied to me earlier today, which shows that these targets, so you might think, targets, they're often missed, that's the nature of targets, we can't expect that at least 95% of people are seen within 4 hours. Obviously there'll be a significant amount of people who fall between the cracks. So now but that's bullshit, between 2004 and 2010, there was not a single month where those targets were missed. So we can have an NHS where more than 95% of people are seen within 4 hours. It's perfectly possible. All you have to do is put decent money towards it, because you tax people who can afford to. And it is since, you can see when the number of these targets being met just collapses. And woe betide, it is after the Tory funding changes of 2010. So since then, it goes down from consistently always being above 95% to, by 2015, being about 92%. And as we know now, going down to 83%. So this is a complete catastrophe for the Conservatives and the NHS. And they are absolutely... So they've reckoned... Obviously, they've been, I think, somewhat complacent on the NHS. I think if you are... I mean, there's two theories of how the Conservatives deal with national health. So one of them is they are committed to making it as shit as possible so that people have a big debate about, is a nationalised healthcare system sustainable, and that becomes an argument to privatise it. It's a very famous Chomsky clip that often gets shared on social media. Very, very insightful, summarised well, as every viral clip of Chomsky is, where he's saying, the strategy of the ruling class is to run down a public service until they can say, to save it, we have to privatise it. So one argument is that's what's been going on over the last 9 years, that they've been intentionally creating a crisis as a justification for privatising the healthcare system. The other option is they felt really complacent and they kind of, they just didn't bother solving the problems in the NHS. And it seems to me at this point that the Conservatives realise, at this point it looks more like it was the latter, and the Conservatives have realised they've kind of fucked up, because they are intensely now trying to make sure that the winter crisis this year is less catastrophic than it had been in previous ones. So I'm going to go to, this was in The Guardian, I think a week ago. It was one of the weekend splashes. And so they've said Downing Street has taken emergency action to head off winter pressures in the NHS amid growing fears in government that a healthcare crisis could derail the Tory party's general election campaign. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been holding regular meetings at Number 10 with the head of the NHS England, Simon Stevens, as evidence mounts of lengthening delays in treatment caused by shortages of doctors and nurses. In addition, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has been seeing Stevens every week on Monday mornings to assess how to prevent a deterioration in waiting times at hospitals and GP surgeries. Now, this is evidence, if you ever needed any, that the Conservatives only care about your health in the middle of an election. So it's literally, they didn't think about funding the service properly, giving the doctors and nurses the resources they needed until 2 months before a general election. Now they're having emergency meetings every week to try and, at least for a short time, put a stopgap into that service so that we don't see piles and piles of trolleys queuing up when, in the winter, as always happens, people get flu at greater frequency. And if the stats are anything to go by today, that is quite likely to happen. And if there is a winter crisis, I do think that makes the Tories' chances of re-election much tougher than they would normally be. Aaron, if there is an NHS winter crisis this year, is Corbyn straight into Number 10?
No.
Do we want to discourage people from getting their flu jabs this year?
No. The
Go on.
NHS has been falling apart for 5 years. It's been underfunded systematically by the Tories for 9 years. And the Tories are still polling 40%. So it's a major issue why people vote Labour, right? It's the number one, it's the number one issue for, even under Ed Miliband, that was like, it was the go-to issue. I just don't think you're going to win over Tory voters on the NHS generally, or just the NHS. It's going to get you a couple of percentage points, but I mean, you have to price in Labour winning people on the NHS already. What would be the difference? The economy, wages, attacking the establishment, etc. I think. I mean, that's what it was in 2017. They didn't get 40% in 2017 because they talked about the NHS. They talked about the NHS in 2015 as well. So it's definitely part of that. And you need to win your base. If Labour are going to win, they obviously have to tick all those boxes. Is it going to make the difference in terms of winning an election, even if the Tories really screw up?
Well, can it win back Labour leavers? So it's not. It won't win over. It won't win over traditional Conservative voters. But the Conservatives have a strategy which is to win over Labour leavers, so that they can win over constituencies that they've never had before. If you get a huge NHS winter crisis, then that is going to impress on people's minds that yes, maybe we do want Brexit, but it's not worth it to have 5 more years of my nan being stuck in a corridor for 6 hours.
But those were Labour voters in 2017, right? Those people generally.
Yeah.
So
yeah, potentially won't get us a majority, but it could destroy the Conservatives' plan to, what do they call it, the Red Wall?
I have no idea.
But they've been briefing it out. It was in the FT the other day. They've been briefing out this idea, a bit like I suppose Trump with I think they called it the Blue Wall, which is the Rust Belt states. So Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio, that's the one. Is it Ohio?
Yeah, Ohio's a Rust Belt state, isn't it?
Is it the one did it swing to Trump?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so yeah, Ohio. So the Tories are doing a similar strategy, but which is based on seats in the north of England, which have always been Labour, but they think they can swing to themselves. And I think an NHS winter crisis could somewhat scupper their plans. I can see, Aaron, you're arguing in the comments about whether or not there's going to be cellular meat or vegetarianism.
No, we're talking about NHS now. That's over.
Okay.
Somebody was saying, how could you eat meat? And I was like, I'm a vegetarian. I want to make clear that I'm not talking purely about sort of non-European food products. There are lots of very, unhygienic European food products. In Italy, there's a Sardinian cheese. It's a maggot cheese. You don't want that travelling across borders either. You ever tried maggot cheese?
I haven't tried maggot cheese. I don't want to either.
Apparently it's delicious.
We're going to talk about one more story before we go to your questions, which is...
Can I just say, actually... Anecdotally on the Labour Leaver thing,
I
was chatting to Laura Pidcock just on Twitter DM the other day, and she said it's really positive news about Labour Leave voters in the North East. And actually the counter argument of Trump and an NHS sweetheart deal for the Americans and the prescription charges going up and medicines maybe being £500 million a month more or whatever, or a week, is it a week?
It would be £500 million a month, not sent to the United States, but that the country would be paying extra for medication.
And these are really powerful arguments to them because they understand the idea of like sort of perfidious America And, and that's obviously very much at odds with the take back control, sovereignty arguments that were peddled by the Leave campaign.
It's actually quite a good point in terms of the comparison between the Red Wall in the United States. So Donald Trump didn't win Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin by arguing for a free trade deal. He did precisely the opposite. He won those seats by arguing against free trade deals. And there is somewhat of a contradiction or a tension or a weakness in the Conservative Party's strategy, whereby they are trying to win over post-industrial Britain by promising a trade deal, by promising more free trade, which, seems like a slightly odd offer. So the extent to which the Labour Party can exploit that tension, I think, could potentially be very key in this upcoming election. Let's talk about Nigel Farage briefly. So today was the day when nominations closed for anyone to stand to be a candidate in the upcoming general election. So every year, in the week before this date, you have lots of speculation, lots of rows about who is or who isn't going to stand down on the left. That means conversations about whether the Greens will stand in Labour Tory marginals for FBPE. Twitter, that's been about whether the Lib Dems will stand down in Labour marginals. And this time around on the right, you've had this big question about whether the Brexit Party will stand down in Conservative marginals. As we spoke about on Tuesday, Nigel Farage announced earlier in the week that the Brexit Party would be standing down in any Tory-held seat. There's been intense pressure, but that they would stand in all Labour-held seats. Now, there has been intense pressure from the Tory side for them to stand down in Labour-Tory marginals, which are currently held by the Labour Party, because as we've just discussed, it is many Labour Leave seats, which the Tories see as crucial for them to get a majority. They want, or they hope that if the Brexit Party stood down, there would be a united Leave vote, which could potentially overturn what are historically large majorities for the Labour Party. It turns out that the Brexit Party have held to their line, or Nigel Farage has held to the line that they will stand in all of those Labour marginals, which are those Labour-held marginals. But Nigel Farage today released a video to camera, sort of opening his heart up to the camera to explain what's been going on. And he made quite a serious allegation about the Conservative Party playing somewhat dirty tricks to try and encourage his candidates to stand down. Are we ready to go to that video? Yeah? I'm going to watch that now.
I've said in the past, and I'll say it again, repeatedly it's been suggested to me that I might like to have a seat in the House of Lords so that I can go quietly. And every time this gets said, my answer is the same. I'm not for sale. I'm not interested. I don't want anything. I just want to get Brexit delivered. So knowing they couldn't buy me off, there was a concerted attempt from people who work deep inside number 10 Downing Street, and I'm not blaming Boris for this. I don't believe he would be part of this, but it shows you the calibre of people he's got around him. It shows you the culture that exists in Westminster. Now, they bypassed me and went to other senior figures in the Brexit Party, suggesting that 8 of them could go into the House of Lords, and all they had to do was come to Nigel and convince him to stand down in a whole load more marginal seats. Well, as you can imagine, I said I do not want, and I will never have, anything to do with this kind of behaviour.
That's quite a serious allegation being made there. He's saying that members of Boris Johnson's team. We saw earlier that Eddie Lister was mentioned by name, but then it seems to have disappeared from
that tweet
from the internet. Did Nigel Farage tweet that it was Eddie Lister who's one of the chiefs of staff?
Let's not libel. I mean,
well, it wouldn't be our libel because it's not our claim.
But we don't know what he wrote, right?
Yeah. In any case,
I don't think he said that. I don't think he alleged that. I think he said something sort of tangential to it.
Yeah. In any case, we're not alleging anything on this show.
Well, we're alleging. We're just not saying.
Well, we're saying that Nigel Farage.
Yeah, we're alleging that he alleged it.
Is that does that count as libel if you say that someone might have said this? I don't know, it seems quite far removed to me. But in any case, it's quite a serious claim that's being made by Nigel Farage, which is that people deep inside the Conservative Party operation and the Downing Street operation are offering peerages to Brexit Party PPCs so that they will stand down in the upcoming election. I mean, the biggest question here for me is what fucking Brexit Party PPC are you going to offer a peerage?
Wasn't PPCs? He said it was eight people, so presumably it's like their equivalent of like a national executive. I mean, they don't have that because it's like It's Trump's, not Trump. It's
No, I thought the
Farage's.
point was that they were going to give. So they wanted candidates to unilaterally stand
He
down.
said 8 people have been approached.
Yeah, but they would be people who are standing in Labour-held
but
marginals.
presumably that's
So
people
a
like
PP
Richard. But presumably it's people like Richard Tice. Presumably it's senior people.
Oh yeah, I suppose he's
who will
senior.
then say
yeah.
to Farage, like, look, we want to be peers in the House of Lords. The whole thing's finished. That's what Farage is alleging, right? And the fact he knows it's 8 people. I mean, maybe it's more. He knows it's 8 people. That's what he's aware of.
It's interesting the distinction he makes between Boris Johnson and his operation. I mean, there's 2 ways of looking at it. One is that potentially he sees that among Brexit, the Brexit Party base, the Conservative Party is unpopular, but Boris Johnson is popular, so he wants to pitch himself as against the Conservative establishment to make himself.
It's pretty smart.
to get appeal amongst those people. The other option is that he's hoping that after the election, Boris Johnson, if he keeps him sweet enough, will give him some kind of role. At the more ambitious end, it would be being ambassador to Trump's America. At the less ambitious end, it would be a peerage. He said he doesn't care about it in that video. He was saying, I don't care about anything for myself. But ultimately, we know that these are the kind of people who change their minds if they find themselves not in the middle of a general election campaign and someone offers them something which is, well, being a lord is both financially quite rewarding and gives someone a certain element of stature that they can keep for life, even if the audience base they achieve on or enjoy on LBC trails off at some point.
Money as well. Money of peer, 300 quid a day. If you
That's what I'm saying. It's financially rewarding.
But it's just like basic, it's not even like, it's just like, just fucking turn up, sit in London for half an hour and fucking 300 quid, boom. Do that 5 days a week, it's 1,500 quid a week. Great. You get to use the resources available to them in the houses of Westminster are gorgeous, much nicer than what MPs get to use. So I can see and also I would also say that people should watch the whole video, because he is quite explicit that he wanted to deal with Boris Johnson. He said there are 150 seats that the Tories have never won, they will never win in the modern era, I presume, and he means basically the north of England. But we could win. They don't like the Tories, but they like us. And he's basically saying and the same standards in the south. The Brexit Party was never going to win. Maybe it could win 1 or 2 seats, but it was never going to win 20, 30 seats in the south. Never. Or UKIP, even at its most popular. And so basically he wanted to kind of compact, which says, we have Leavers in the north, you have Leave voters in the south. And the Tories said no. And so he was absolutely looking for something from Boris. And I think the reason why, Boris Johnson rather, and the reason why, like you say, he draws that distinction between Johnson and his team is I think he probably still would like to. If there's a hung parliament, Farage is a variable again, isn't he?
Let's go to some questions.
Yeah.
I mean, if there is a hung parliament, well, Farage is only a variable if the Brexit Party gets some seats, which I think is quite unlikely.
No, but he's a variable in so much as there's a hung parliament. We don't really have any sort of deal that can go through, and we'll just stay in this limbo. And then the debate, you have more European elections, you have more, local elections, etc. Where the Brexit Party will be a problem for the Tories, unless the Tories, can deliver Brexit. So he will be a variable if there's a hung parliament, not in the Westminster sense, but in the broader political sense.
I mean, what would be quite smart for Nigel Farage is he, lets Boris Johnson get a majority, because I don't think a second referendum would be, particularly... If you've got Boris Johnson in power negotiating Brexit and negotiating a free trade deal, then Nigel Farage can constantly be breathing down the neck of Boris Johnson, saying if you let up and negotiate a fairly soft Brexit deal at this point, he'll say, I'll be back with a vengeance in 5 years' time, which could be possible. Many people who voted Brexit who realise, shit, my life hasn't got any better. People who have become at that point disenfranchised from the Labour Party because of their commitment to Brexit, and then say, well, my vote for the Tories was obviously a joke. Now I'm looking for a different party who I can vote for, who really represented what I meant when I voted Leave, which would be potentially when you could get a bounce back from Nigel Farage. Oh, it could be his final...
Look, 2015, we thought UKIP got 3.8 million votes. 2016, they failed to win... 2017, rather, January 2017, they failed to win the Stoke-on-Trent by-election. They collapsed in the 2017 general election. We thought that was it. It wasn't that long ago. It was about 9-10 months ago. Farage was doing his march through Sunderland with 40 people in the pissing rain, and people thought he was over. And, by May, they had 35 MEPs. In 1 or 2 national general election polls, they're polling above both the Tories and Labour, which, by the way, that same polling is being used by Lib Dems on leaflets. Just shows you how ridiculous it is. They're now polling 5%, not fucking 35%. So... don't write off a sort of third comeback. He's like a sort of fungal infection. Or he's like, it's like, a chest infection.
Or cold sore.
Yeah, you take
like a cold sore.
You take your first course of antibiotics, you don't really finish it. He comes back, you take another one, he comes back. So if he's come back before, why couldn't he again?
Let's go to some questions. I like this one. Adam Dransfield. Does the recent move on Scotland go far enough to sorting out Labour's problems in Scotland? Does the limp engagement mean that Labour don't care or have consigned Scotland to independence? Consigned Scotland to independence is a sort of leading way of phrasing that, I suppose. Scotland has been one of the big stories of the last 2 days, and it has been somewhat interesting. So you have Corbyn, who I suppose, or it was McDonnell originally, who at the Edinburgh Festival, when he was talking to Ian Dale, said that he didn't want the Labour Party, or McDonnell said he didn't want the Labour Party to stand in the way of a Scottish referendum if it was demanded by the Scottish people. He respects the right of self-determination, and so said that it would be wrong for Labour to do that. Very, ethically, politically legit position, fundamentally. The Conservatives, as you'll have noticed, are going really hard on this idea now that means what John McDonnell said and what sort of Jeremy Corbyn has repeated means that the Labour Party want not one but two referendums next year, because Nicola Sturgeon is demanding a Scottish referendum next year, and Labour are obviously offering or promising a second referendum on Europe next year. Corbyn, I suppose, to try and close down that particular line of attack, said that he would not offer Nicola Sturgeon a referendum on her time frame, which means that it wouldn't happen until at least 2021. People are speculating that maybe in government the deal would be with Nicola Sturgeon about if you get another majority at the Holyrood elections, then potentially you can push for one. And as we know, there's going to be a particular court case which could be damaging for the SNP between now and then. Potentially their fortunes could change.
What about the Catalonia option? Just hold a referendum anyway.
Yeah. Well, the argument I always make, when people are sort of saying, "Oh, Labour want an independent Scotland," is you say that no. I mean, I'm personally ambivalent about independent Scotland. I suppose I'd prefer to have Scotland as part of the UK, because I feel like Scots are a bit more progressive than many other parts of the UK, and so we have a greater chance of having a progressive politics for the whole of the UK. But if they want to leave, fine, so be it. But the argument for why McDonnell and Corbyn's position actually is a unionist one is because, obviously not a dogmatically unionist one, but is a sensible one if you are a unionist, is that probably the only thing that could turbocharge Nicola Sturgeon's claim for or demand for independence, I suppose, one is a very hard Brexit, which the Conservative Party are offering, or two, an ability to say there is a mandate within Scotland for another referendum, but it's being denied in London. And that's precisely what turbocharged the Catalonian movement for independence, was the fact that it was so clearly unjust that the central state, that the Madrid government, was denying the right of self-determination to Catalonia. And over quite a short period of time, Catalan independence, which has always been, alive and well, but it was always a minority issue, has become the demand of an overwhelming majority of that region of Spain. So you can argue it's a unionist position, what they're saying. But something that is a bit interesting about it, and I think a bit odd, is that obviously Scottish Labour have made a decision that they need to get the unionist vote, because they think that's what distinguishes them from the SNP, and they worry that by having a somewhat ambivalent line, they got squeezed by both the SNP and the more avowedly unionist Lib Dem and Conservative Party. So they're sort of saying they're really hard line against independence. They attack the SNP quite a lot. They attack independence quite a lot. And then you've got the Labour Party in England who are saying independence, maybe not such a bad thing. And to me, electorally, that seems like you've really got things the wrong way around, because I think Scottish Labour's resurgence or revival demands that they seem a bit more open-minded about independence. I think given that this is a strongly held identity by many people who were previously of their base, I think you can say policy-wise, we really don't want to have independence, but to sort of try and attack the movement for independence as much as they seem to do and attack the SNP as much as they seem to do, to me just seems somewhat counterproductive. But I could see why in England, remembering 2015, where the Conservatives made it a big attack line about Ed Miliband, that he was going to bring about Scottish independence and that he was in the pocket of, then it was Alex Salmond, I'd have thought you'd expect British Labour or UK Labour to have a somewhat more negative tone towards independence than Scottish Labour, but you've got the reverse, which to me does seem like a sort of electorally counterintuitive relationship between the party in London and the party in Edinburgh.
Yeah. I mean, I can see arguments both ways, but I think Scottish Labour I actually had a thing to say, but you just carried on talking, Michael. So it was,
what was the thing you were going to say?
As enlightening as it was,
Did
it was
you
very
forget?
enlightening. Have I forgotten? It was about Scotland, Scottish Labour. Come on, Michael. Try and push me here. Come on. What could I have been thinking? You know me well.
I can't read your mind, especially when I'm reading
Some
questions.
keywords.
Tell us if you come back to it.
Oh, no, that's it. I can see the arguments both for and against. The reality is, if Scotland's independent, would it become a sort of nominally social democratic country? Probably. Why? Has huge amounts of unused land, right? Could take huge numbers of immigrants, which is obviously one of the easiest ways to get growth is just to get more people. You could have greater urbanization. It's like a mini Canada. It's like a mini Sweden. You could have massive forestry, wind power, more agriculture. You know, it could be a very successful social democratic economy. So the idea that it couldn't be successful because it's too small is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Just put it out there. However, you know, would that necessarily feed into a socialist project? Not really. You know, not necessarily. So as a socialist, you know, I think there's an argument either way. Then there's the broader argument about, well, if Scotland cedes away from the Union, what happens to England? What happens to English nationalism or British nationalism post-Scotland? And that could be quite ugly. You know, that could be really ugly. And so people do have to think about that. And you see lots of Scots say, well, you know, see you later, end of British imperialism. You know what? Sometimes the death throes of these things can be very ugly. So, you know, I wouldn't be flippant about it. But at the end of the day, on the left, you're meant to believe in self-determination. People that live in Scotland, it's for them to decide. And that's why McDonnell has a very good, strong leftist line of national self-determination.
Yeah. And I suppose that the counter to saying that they should, you know, if it brought Ed Miliband, or if it damaged Ed Miliband's campaign that he was seen as being in the pocket of Alex Salmond, and Ed Miliband, what he did was vociferously deny that he would make a deal with the SNP to have a second referendum. And actually, to be honest, it'd be quite easy in negotiations over a confidence and supply arrangement for the Labour Party to hold the line on that if that's what they chose, because I don't think the SNP would want to be seen as allowing Boris Johnson to have the keys into Downing Street, especially when you've got the Remain Leave issue.
I remember what I was going to say now.
Okay, go on.
Which was the SNP are kind of really sitting pretty because they gain politically whatever happens. If Labour somehow become the largest party in a hung parliament, they always don't want a Labour majority. They'll then be the kingmakers in a sort of, you know, confidence and supply. If Boris Johnson wins and the Tories get a majority, they say, look, we're tied to no matter how...
5 years of Boris Johnson will turbocharge
Oh my God. So really, you know, the SNP can't really lose here. They really can't lose. It's great for them. It's absolutely fantastic for them.
And Nicola Sturgeon's a very effective politician.
Yeah. So, you know, it can play out either way. You know, I would argue there's a really strong interest actually in Labour getting absolutely hammered. Look at it causally. Since when has Scottish independence been a mainstream thing? You know, the SNP only had like 6 seats until 2015, right? It's since the collapse of Labour, and it's since basically the collapse of Labour as a viable national government. New Labour, obviously, and how it governed explains the long-term deterioration of Scotland's sort of propensity to vote Labour. But
there was an alienation of the base.
For sure, but
it didn't flip into the referendum. That was the
pitch is Scotland's voted Labour basically in every election, I think bar one or something, since 1945, and yet most of the time you get a Tory government at Westminster. That's the argument. And so it suits them perfectly well to have Boris Johnson and leave obviously not in the short term, but to leave the European Union, to have a sort of cantankerous, belligerent, Eton-educated guy as Prime Minister. That suits their narrative, yeah. And alternatively, you know, Corbyn government allows them to do Devo Max. They'd have leverage like never before over a Westminster government. So yeah, they win either way.
I mean, you could say that if what they want is independence, they win more if Boris Johnson becomes leader, because that will turbocharge them. And you could, if you were being cynical about it, you could say that that's why Nicola Sturgeon is not being particularly helpful to Jeremy Corbyn.
I think that's precisely right.
Because she is saying specifically, if he doesn't give me a referendum next year, I will block him entering government, which is making it seem like either a hung parliament with Labour as the largest party, or any kind of hung parliament where there's no route to Boris Johnson entering Downing Street. You'll either get another general election or you'll get a second referendum. Now, I actually think that Nicola Sturgeon would fold in those negotiations, but the fact that she's saying it now isn't particularly helpful to the campaign south of
They
the
also
border.
want Devo. They do want Devo Max. All the things they've talked about. They say independence isn't an outcome; it's a process. They've said that stuff. They want Devo Max. They want more powers. That's what they would want. They think in the sort of medium term, that's more likely to guarantee independence. Anyway, next question.
Kai Kiswani's given us a $5 and he says, maggot cheese, what the fuck, Aaron?
I've never tried it. Apparently, it's delicious. It's like, imagine what the fermentation process is like accelerated, right? Because all these larvae are basically like eating the cheese and pooping it out.
Is Boris Johnson going to lose to Ali Milani now that the deadline for registration has passed?
Go on.
I mean, the fact he hasn't, I can see why he didn't want to move, because it would have looked, they're trying to run a campaign which is, confident, and where they feel like they're going to get a majority, and they always, call the opposition useless, etc. And he doesn't want to move from his seat, which has a 5,000 majority, because it would seem like, that's him admitting that there is going to be a swing away from the Conservatives. To be honest, if I was him, I would have said, I'm going to leave, but the reason isn't because I think Labour are going to get a swing. It's because they're pumping in so many activists and sort of make it seem like what the Labour Party are doing is to some degree undemocratic because they're shipping in activists or something like that. Obviously, it'd be a weak argument, but I think having him in a seat with a 5,000 majority, which with a great Labour Party candidate and with thousands of people knocking on doors, is a genuine risk to him. I think he could lose that seat.
I'd put it 50-50.
Which is incredible. I mean, I don't think it is that. Is it how Romania is the seat? It might, because lots of those seats in outer London are actually about 50-50.
I don't think it's that Romania. But I think actually that's not even a variable. I think the primary variables would be, there'll be just lots of anti-Boris people, right? I think it's really, the reality is you've got tens of thousands of Labour members who will happily, tens of thousands will happily canvass there at least once. They're going to have a contact rate which
is phenomenal
in Uxbridge and Ruislip. They're going to have 100% in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to contact everybody multiple times. Ali's literally going to be, how many people is he going to be talking to on the doorstep compared to Johnson? Johnson's having to run a national campaign, right? So,
but it doesn't mean he has lots of name recognition. So they also say that name recognition is quite good for
sure.
MP.
But I think it's really
didn't help Ed Balls.
It's 50-50. It's as Lamar once said, right about now it's 50. It's it's really close. And I'm actually kind of impressed he's not run away. I thought he would. But then Tories have been making big mistakes recently. Cameron called a referendum in 2016, thought he'd get away with it. May called a general election in 2017, thought she'd get away with it. Maybe Johnson's big mistake, even if the Tories end up being the biggest party, is staying in that seat.
Well, and what's interesting is that nearly in every occasion where they fucked up, it's because of hubris.
Precisely.
And this would be exactly the same, right? It'd be because of hubris that they've stayed there. Will Labour's manifesto launch be the turning point for Labour's polling numbers? Quite possibly. Too early to say.
Can I just say, we've got 1,262 people watching this. Well, 1,267. We should do a shout out about, support, etc. But it's at the same time as the England-Montenegro match.
Don't tell them about the
But that's amazing. I mean, that just shows you what a great show you're doing here on TyskySour and Novara Media, which would not be possible without
your support. So if you are a subscriber, thank you very much. You're what makes TyskySour. You're what makes Novara Media possible. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. And also, actually, don't just do that. Even if you are already a supporter, maybe you should tweet that link to other people, to your friends, especially to your friends with lots of money, who get a high hourly wage. I wouldn't say, I think share it to everyone, and especially share it to people on low wage, because they've got an interest in bringing about socialism. But that particular support.novaramedia.com link, send that to your rich friends.
Yeah.
What you could ask for is from your rich friends, if you've got so many objects you don't want anymore, they ask you what you want for Christmas, you tell them, I want you to give an hourly wage to Novara Media every month.
I think that should be a thing. It shouldn't even just be Novara, TWT. I mean, the World Transform do amazing stuff, right? If somebody said, Aaron, if my dad's partner said, I'll give you a Christmas gift, I'd be like, give 20 quid to TWT. That'd be great. They should do that, like a voucher thing. We should do that.
Bliss Winters says, Novara is vital in challenging media hegemony. We love you. We love you too, Bliss Winters. Great name. This is a good question. Did you see this today, Aaron?
No.
BBC refers to... I haven't said the question yet. BBC refers to Corbyn getting into number 10 as the Long March today. Could a Labour government save the BBC,
that?
Reverse the bias? Oh, it was amazing. Did you not see that?
No, I've not seen this.
No, it's incredible. So the BBC are doing, profiles of each party. So it's a feature, basically.
Who's presenting it?
It's an article on the website.
Right, okay.
It's by Ian Watson. And the framing of the framing of the article is, Corbyn will Corbyn achieve his long march, or will his long march work? Comparing him to
it's
Mao.
good. It's funny. Good.
And then
we do have the reality is we have to have a long march through the institutions.
The subheading was the reluctant leader or the surprise leader. You know, like the whole framing was sort of like Corbyn wasn't supposed to be a party leader and is a Marxist. Which, I mean, you know, to be fair, there's some truth to it. But if you're an impartial broadcaster, that's not really the element you should. You know, if you're writing a profile, there's obviously going to be some truth to everything you say. But if you're an impartial broadcaster, you have to think quite carefully about what elements of a story are you highlighting, and are you feeding into people's original, you know, prejudices about a person. And I don't know what they're going to do about the other parties. I mean, you're going to have to be pretty. I mean, if they do a glowing one of all the other parties, which doesn't reference any, you know, historical leader of a non-democratic regime, then I think Labour probably have grounds to complain.
As somebody said here, the Long March was pretty fucking successful, to be honest. And also, look, we do have to have a long march in the institutions. It's important to say this to people watching. I think my view is Labour will be the largest party at the general election. Does that mean a majority? We don't know. That's my view. I may be wrong. Even then, even if Labour won a majority of 20, you know, everything we're seeing in this general election now from the media would be times 5 every day of a Labour government. This is going to be a very long-term project about a Green New Deal, about transforming the media, about rebuilding the economy, about ending massive regional inequality, about a proper constitutional settlement, elected second chamber, you know, electoral reform, written constitution. All these things, they're going to take 20, 30 years, you know. This is not all going to change on December 13th with the Labour government. That's going to be one of the major steps, obviously. But yeah, so long march, obviously the BBC shouldn't be saying it, but it is a long march.
Ethel the Cat says, I have donated £20 a month since January and gave £50 towards the studio fundraiser. Can I get a thumbs up from Novara Media? You most certainly can, Ethel the Cat. Thank you so much.
Legend.
You make this possible. We've been on for over an hour. Should we end soon? You want to do one more question?
I'm quite enjoying it, actually.
Okay, let's do...
I'm quite enjoying the questions because people have got a lot to talk about right now. I mean, another 10 minutes.
Fox is going to want to go home at some point. We'll do another 10 minutes. Someone is asked, if Jeremy Corbyn comes to power, will there be a military coup like there has been in Bolivia? It's an interesting question because I do think that if Jeremy Corbyn comes to power, there will be a counterattack from the establishment and from the deep state and from business interests. I doubt it would come in the form of troops on the street. I think that's something where you're quite lucky if you live in one of the advanced capitalist nations that you're probably not going to have a military coup.
Well, it was mooted in the 70s. We did have a civil war on our doorstep until 1997, Michael. Just people don't think of it as Britain, but we did.
Wasn't a coup though, was it?
No, but it was highly militarized society, which, formally speaking, didn't adhere to a lot of democratic norms until very recently. Not on mainland England. There's a great book, a low intensity sort of, I can't remember what it's called, Frank Kitson, who basically worked on a lot of the sort of counterinsurgency stuff for the British Army, learned a lot of his lessons in Burma. And the book's written in the early 1970s. It's very good. Frank Kitson. And he basically writes the book with an eye to Northern Ireland in the early 70s. And he's saying what we're seeing right now in Northern Ireland may come to the British mainland in the next 10 years because of the leftist threats, etc., etc. So it wasn't that long ago people were talking about these things seriously. I mean, I happen to agree with you.
Yeah.
But, it's not implausible that in major Western countries we will see that kind of stuff.
Scaris says something which I half agree with. They say there won't be a coup, but they'll wreck his project. The reason I say half agree is because what they will try and do is wreck his project. We don't know if they'll agree. We don't know if they'll, achieve it. Hopefully they won't. But yeah, I mean, the way that would happen is similar to what we've seen in the last 4 years, which is that you'd have, various smears and stories planted. You'd be trying to get the movement to sort of fight against itself. You'd have, daily attacks from all of the broadsheets, all of the newspapers, which would filter into the BBC, as we've just talked about today, by controlling the news cycle, by even if you've got a complete lie which is made up by the opposition or made up by a particular journalist, then the story becomes Labour denies XYZ. Labour denies that they executed a bunch of call centre workers in Swindon.
Well, look, people are dying right now in the NHS all the time. They're dying on trolleys and so on and so forth. And it's this as a minor story about it, right? But not really. Or somebody dies because an ambulance takes 6 hours to get someone. This stuff is literally happening on a daily basis. You know?
I mean, you also, to be fair, I mean, you
But that
won't-
would be magnified massively under a Labour government. This one person died because this ambulance.
yeah,
like,
absolutely.
That all of a sudden, nobody's
That's a
mentioning
really
on,
good
the,
point.
on the BBC or the Sun, and like Labour's inheriting this like chaotic NHS. The second they inherit it, they'll be like, you know, Jeremy Corbyn is personally responsible for this person who died because an ambulance was 5 hours late. You know,
And they'll be like,
from
that
week
happened
one.
100,000 times last year, and it's
Yeah.
only happened 1,000 times under us. And they'll be like, well, it seems like that's whataboutery, actually.
Yeah.
It's whataboutery
Whataboutery.
to talk about the fact that this happened 10 times more the year before you came into power than now. We're asking you about this specific person who specifically died on this specific ambulance. I mean, also, if we're going to be real, the establishment trying to bring down Corbyn, there's a number of steps before military coup where they could quite easily just coax the PLP into bringing him down. So, I mean, there's the big problem that Corbyn is going to have is that the moment the going gets tough because you've got these ridiculous stories about something happening that's completely not out of the ordinary, but they've made it seem out of the ordinary. You'll have all the backbench MPs saying, oops, in the national interest,
You don't need
we're
guns.
going to bring down Jeremy Corbyn.
You don't need guns when you've got Ben Bradshaw and Jess Phillips. But no, that's absolutely true. Paul Mason put it beautifully a couple of years ago. You know, the establishment, the British establishment, the line, I can't even read that. What does it say? Oh, yeah, the burner. We need to put the burner.
Ah, yeah.
Paul Mason put it beautifully when he said that the sort of trench, the primary trench of the British establishment runs through the Labour Party, which is absolutely true. It's like the last ditch. That's the last defence of the British establishment. If all else fails, if you get a Labour government, if you have a militant union movement, you know, with a popular programme from the people, it can at least be wrecked from within by the Labour Party. So I mean, that's absolutely
Have
true.
you seen A Very British Coup?
Oh, great.
Yeah.
It's on More 4 if people want to watch it.
So actually what happens in that one is that you see that, you know, within the cabinet there's someone who's, you know, basically become an informer to, or working on behalf of, I think, MI5.
Yeah. The
Be
deep
interest-
state, right?
The deep state.
The
So,
civil
I mean, it
service,
would be,
MI5, the papers.
would be interesting if that was going on again.
It'd be interesting. I don't know about that.
I mean, there'd be many people in the PLP who'd think that they would be serving the national interest by bringing down a Jeremy Corbyn government. I mean,
yeah, they
that's
do. They do.
uncontroversial.
They think, you know. I remember once I did
I mean,
something.
they tweet, don't they? Text it all the time to Kevin Schofield. So
Yeah.
the top Labour source says that it would be better to have a military coup than have Jeremy
Yeah.
Corbyn
I did-
increase funding into
I
the
did
NHS
BBC
by
Any
5%
Questions
a year.
with Ben Bradshaw, and like he literally was like, "Why?" He literally started, and everybody was perfectly polite to me. Jonathan Dimbleby, Nadeem Zahawi, actually a National Farmers Union lady. She was lovely. Got talking to her afterwards about farming, and the most horrible person to me was Ben Bradshaw, and he actually explicitly said on the show, "I don't know why he's here." And like those people hate us more than anyone else. They hate us more than Nadeem Zahawi does, because with the right, and I've said this before to you, I did this week when it still existed with Andrew Neil, with Portillo, with Liz Kendall, with Lord Winston. Everybody was lovely to me except Liz Kendall. Lord Winston had a glass of wine with him. We're talking about anti-Semitism. I said, "Oh, it's terrible, etc." You know, I don't think it's as bad as you think. Here's why. We had a perfectly civil conversation. I had a Japanese whiskey with Andy Neil. Portillo, perfectly congenial. They obviously despise my politics, but they're just polite civil people because that's what conservatives are like. Liz Kendall literally couldn't look me in the eye. Why? Because for them, I politically disagree with you. For her, well, for 25 years, I've been the most left-wing person in the room. I've been the goodie.
So you threaten her identity.
Exactly. And it's a much more powerful thing. And so those people, we're going to threaten their identity for a long time, and they're never going to stop hating us, I think, a lot of them.
Oh, someone's asking, Mr. Strand GS is asking, how do we feel about John Curtis saying we have no chance for a majority?
He didn't say that.
Did he not? I haven't heard
He
the
said the
actual
chances
interview.
right now of a Labour majority are as close to zero as can be like said within reason or something. There are a few caveats.
That's quite close to zero, though, isn't it?
No, but then he said the two most likely outcomes are a Labour minority government or a massive Tory majority.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, there's the Tory minority. Sorry, the Tory minority government is also possible as
Yeah,
well.
it's quite strange to say that those are the main two
Those
options.
are two like quite divergent outcomes. So it didn't really make much sense to me.
I mean, I suppose the issue is it does seem very unlikely that we're going to win back Scotland, which does make winning a majority pretty goddamn difficult.
It's improbable.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to hear what he says about, because I take his opinion very seriously, very sharp guy, about Labour being the biggest party. I'd like to hear what he thinks about that. Because those are two separate questions.
I'd imagine that he was... I mean, I haven't listened to this interview, but I'd imagine from what you've just said that he thinks it's the most likely outcome is either a Conservative majority or the Conservatives being the largest party, but Labour having a route to a government because the SNP are never going to prop up a Tory government. And to have a Conservative minority government, you need the quite specific maths, which is having 10 DUP MPs being the kingmakers. Because I can't, obviously Jo Swinson has far more allegiance to the Conservative Party than she does to anyone in the Labour Party. But given that they're two, key positions, one of them is to revoke Article 50 and one of them is to have a very hard Brexit.
Jo Swinson...
I think her propping up a Boris Johnson government would be somewhat implausible.
Somebody has to put this in the comments. The Tories aren't running a candidate against Jo Swinson in her seat, East Dunbartonshire. We'll know that now, actually, if it's been confirmed or not. That was the rumour.
Wow. No, the Conservatives have been very clear that they're going to stand in every.
Well, I don't know. There
seat.
wasn't a candidate named in East Dunbartonshire like a week
ago. If they hadn't done that, that would have been an absolute gift to the Brexit Party, who could say that the Conservatives wouldn't stand down for the Brexit Party, but they would stand down for the Lib Dems. I mean,
let's find out.
They'd be idiots if they did that.
You need to big up the burner before we go.
We're going to big up the burner, which is the daily, brilliant election podcast from James Butler. It goes out about 7 a.m. He records it at about 6:10, so respect to him. And at the moment, it's potentially going to come out as a podcast next week, but at the moment, what you need to do is you need to download Telegram. And what do? Do you click on a particular link? How do you get... I've got it on my phone, but I've forgotten how I got it.
It's a Telegram app. Just go to Telegram, and then the link is... It's a Telegram link. Maybe we can put it up at the bottom of the...
We'll put it in this show description, because what you need to do is download Telegram, then click on a link which subscribes you to the burner
this chat
every day, which is completely unmissable.
It's very good.
It's probably James Butler's pinned tweet as well. Just tell me. You can speak. Great. If you go to novara.media/telegram, you will be able to
Fox,
subscribe
you're
to
in
the
the
burner.
show as well. We're going to get Fox Cam, we're going to get Gary Cam. You don't need to whisper.
You don't need to whisper or send me the WhatsApp. Just shout it at me.
Also, if people want to feedback on that, because James says he wants to hear what people, want to listen to in the mornings. And also, look, that may be a thing after the election. We don't know. If you think it's really good, if you think that could replace, the Today programme, let us know, and we could have our own podcast feed on iTunes or whatever for it. So feedback always welcome.
Oh, A is saying you can get the burner on SoundCloud, mate.
Yeah, you can get it on SoundCloud, but it's not a particularly nice interface, is it?
Yeah, you want to get it on Telegram. Go to novara.media/Telegram. Great. Let's call it an evening, eh?
Let's do that.
We will be back soon. At the very latest, we'll be back on Tuesday to go live straight after the first prime ministerial debates between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn to talk about what has gone on in those. Instant reaction. Potentially we'll have one before then, so make sure you are subscribed to our YouTube channel and that you get notifications whenever we go live. Follow us on Twitter because we always announce it beforehand there. Thank you as ever for watching the show. Thank you, Aaron Bastani, for joining me this evening.
My pleasure. Have we got anything else to shout out?
Thank you, Fox, for producing the show.
Thank you, Fox. Oh, yeah, and also, It'll Go Higher. Please promote that.
How do they sign up to It'll Go Higher?
It's doing well as well, by the way. Good question. It'll Go Higher.
we need to look up how you sign up to this. Please. Fox, could you shout? Do you know how to sign up to It'll Go Higher? You don't know that one.
Look, we've got 1,300 people, so we should let people know how to do it. But basically, we've now got a second newsletter. The first one was with Ash, the Cortado, out every Thursday morning. It's great. But we've got a new one out. It'll Go Higher every Monday morning in your inbox first thing.
The thing with URLs, doesn't everyone I use Google for everything. So I just say Novara Media, the Cortado, and then it would come up. Novara Media, It'll Go Higher, it will come up. Just use your initiative.
I think so. It's also like with these tactical voting apps.
I Google images.
Tactical voting apps. I don't need a fucking app. I just need to Google my constituency and look at the vote in 2017. Really not that hard. I don't need Best for Britain to lie to me through some bizarre algorithm. Thank you.
All right, you can Google how to sign up to It'll Go Higher. But do so. And then sign up because it's very good. Good night.